Chapter 672. White Lotus sat up. Lu Chen stared at the girl in front of him. Although it had only been a few days since they last met, for some reason, he felt that the White Lotus in front of him had become a little unfamiliar. Of course, in fact, Lu Chen did not have a deep understanding of White Lotus. It was just that these days he had more opportunities to spend more time with White Lotus, so they were somewhat familiar with each other. But now there was a strange feeling in that familiar feeling. It was as if a drop of soy sauce had suddenly fallen into a bowl of porridge. It didn't look too obvious, but even though it still looked white, it was still different from before. The expression on White Lotus's face also looked a little strange. She looked at Lu Chen in a daze, as if she was carefully observing this man. After a while she said, "What's the matter?" Lu Chen was about to speak, when suddenly a series of footsteps came from the door. Both of them turned their heads together, and saw Black Dog walking in from outside the door. Atsu stood at the door, then raised his head, a pair of green eyes flashing, and suddenly growled at White Lotus in a low voice, with some obvious hostility. The room was originally quiet, but now no one spoke. White Lotus's body shrank back a little, as if she was a little afraid. Lu Chen looked at Atsu for a moment, then shook his head, stood up, walked to Atsu, and reached out to stop Atsu. Then he turned back to look at White Lotus on the other side of the room, smiled and said, "I don't know what's wrong with this stupid dog recently. It's always like this. I'll take it out first. I don't have anything urgent to do anyway. I'll talk to you later." White Lotus hesitated for a moment, as if a little surprised, but she still nodded and agreed. Lu Chen led Atsu out of the room and into the courtyard. Without stopping, he walked through the corridor and quietly left the house. They followed the small alley all the way to the horse washing bridge. Lu Chen's footsteps slightly paused for a moment. He looked at Atsu, then nodded and said, "Dog nose is quite sensitive." "Woof!" Atsu barked. Lu Chen smiled and turned back to look at the depths of the darkness. Then he said, "Let's go." I wanted to explain it to her, but who knew that after such a long time, she wouldn't even mention that branch. Days passed. As the sea of blood in the sky got closer and closer to the center, the gap above the city became smaller and smaller. The entire immortal city became darker and darker. It looked like it was about to completely sink into the blood-red light. In the past, the blood sea phenomenon had covered the sky, but to be honest, it had never been as depressing as it was now. Perhaps this slow and gradual process made people collapse, so more and more people fled from the immortal city. The originally bustling streets were a lot more deserted. More than half of those who could walk had left. Those who were left were either ambitious people who wanted to take advantage of the chaos to make a fortune, or those who had nowhere to go. In contrast, almost no one left Mount Tianlong. This also showed the strong control of the few big shots in Zhangxianmeng. This also made Mount Tianlong unexpectedly become the most lively and crowded place in the immortal city. However, things were still slowly changing. The inspection of going up and down the mountain gradually began to become stricter, and the division of forces became very obvious. In the past, everyone was under the same Zhangxianmeng, and all the passages up and down could be walked without obstruction. But now there was a faint trend of separation. Fuyunji controlled a few checkpoints up and down the mountain, and other people from the Dazai Yuan and Heavenly Law Hall could not pass through here. The same thing also happened in the territories of the other major forces. In the past, people often moved around with each other, but now everyone tightly guarded the territories of their own forces. They did not dare to go out easily, let alone go to the territories of other forces. In this strange situation, no one knew what would happen. Whether it was Supreme Lord Tianlan, Supreme Lord Taihu, or Supreme Lord Guangbo, none of them actually came out to say or give similar specific orders. But things were just so strange. Everyone silently reached a tacit agreement to be hostile to each other, and gathered more and more people in their respective territories. In this regard, Lu Chen did not understand at first. Even if they wanted to attack others, wouldn't it be better to attack when they were alone, or when there were fewer people? Now this kind of situation was forcing people to stick together more and more tightly. Wasn't this just asking for trouble? He once raised this question to Supreme Lord Tianlan, but Supreme Lord Tianlan only smiled without saying anything, and asked him to think about it himself after a few more days. Lu Chen stared at the sea of blood in the sky and thought for a long time. When the sky darkened, the sun rose and the moon set after an unknown number of days had passed. The last bit of the sky was about to be swallowed by the sea of blood. Supreme Lord Tianlan sent someone to call Lu Chen over, and then took him straight to the cave in the underground city at the foot of the mountain. On the way, Supreme Lord Tianlan seemed to ask Lu Chen casually, "Have you thought it through?" Lu Chen pondered for a moment and said, "I've thought about it for a long time, but it is reasonable to say that no matter what, as long as it is to deal with those people, it is not a good strategy to let them gather their strength like this. Unless..." Supreme Lord Tianlan replied with a looked at Lu Chen with a slightly questioning look, and said, "Unless what?" "Unless you already have some tricks up your sleeves and set up an unknown trap that you are extremely confident of winning. So the more strength the enemy gathers, the happier you will be, and you will be able to completely destroy them in one go?" Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed out loud and walked away with his hands behind his back, saying with a smile, "Something like that." Behind him, Lu Chen rolled his eyes. He thought to himself, "This damned Baldy is now arrogant to the point that he's somewhat unreasonable." He was not going to deal with ordinary people, but a few soul formation perfected lords working together. When they walked to the entrance of the tunnel leading to the underground city, Lu Chen noticed that there were clearly more guards here than before. After a rough estimation, there were at least 3 times more guards. In the crowd, Lu Chen did not see Lu Ting and the others whom he knew previously, as if they had been replaced. "I've already told Shui Ying and the others about the matters above ground," Supreme Lord Tianlan said to Lu Chen. "Go down with me. The matters below are more important." Lu Chen took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "Is it time?" Supreme Lord Tianlan looked up at the sky, and so did Lu Chen. In the sky, in the center of the sea of blood, there was only a gap with a radius of less than 100 feet left. From afar, it seemed like it would be completely drowned in the blink of an eye. "We're almost there," Supreme Lord Tianlan said to Lu Chen calmly. "Let's go, we're going to do something important." Chapter 673. Fuyunji was currently the most powerful hall in Zhengxianmeng, so the benefits they occupied were also the largest. In reality, the most eye-catching thing was that Fuyunji also owned the most magnificent and imposing hall in the whole of Zhengxianmeng. To be honest, Fuyunji's arrogant behavior was very repulsive. On top of the mountain, outside of the city, there were countless people who disliked Fuyunji. However, so what if they were not pleasing to the eye? Hadn't the Fuyun organization still stood strong for many years and not fallen? Moreover, they were becoming stronger and stronger. In recent days, they even had a feeling of looking down on everyone. They faintly showed signs of going against the entire true immortal alliance on their own. A mere hall in Zhengxianmeng was so arrogant, but it seemed that no one could do anything to Fuyunji for the time being. This was very surprising. However, when he thought of the lofty big shop behind the Floating Clouds company, he seemed to have some understandable reasons. Fuyunji was personally created by this big boss, True Lord Tianlan, but this famous bald True Lord had never personally served as the leader of Fuyunji. In fact, since the establishment of Fuyunji, for so many years in everyone's memory, there was only one hall master, and that was Shui Ying. This mysterious but powerful woman could be said to be the most powerful person in Zhengxianmeng, other than the few soul formation true lords. She was powerful, and under the control of Fuyunji, with the support of True Lord Tianlan, she personally turned Fuyunji into the terrifying beast that it was today. Perhaps it was because this kind of achievement was too eye-catching that in the Celestial City on Celestial Dragon Mountain, there would often be scenes of the Floating Clouds company becoming so powerful. Did True Lord Tianlan contribute more, or did Blood Warbler take the main credit? Today, when Old Ma walked into this magnificent and majestic hall, and saw the beautiful woman sitting on the throne in the hall, he couldn't help but think of this rumor that had been passed down for many years. Shui Ying sat high up on the throne. The towering throne and the majestic stone pillars on both sides, as well as the lifelike carvings of a coiling dragon, painted on the dome of the Great Hall, were like an inverted universe. And that woman was the center of this small world. She was beautiful, cold, determined, and powerful. Everyone who came here, regardless of whether they were men or women, seemed to have an urge to look up and worship her. They would subconsciously think and acknowledge that she was the master of this place. She belonged here, she led here, she would coexist with this place for a long time, until she aged and died. However, in reality, there was an inconspicuous but sharp thorn that would never disappear. The real master of this place was someone else. Old Ma walked over, saluting and greeting Shuang. Shuang was handling some affairs. Recently, there were too many things to do in Fuyunji. Fuyunji, which was originally like a quiet, sleeping beast, after Shui Ying's orderly and decisive orders, Old Ma could feel that the terrifying beast was gradually waking up. Shui Ying saw Old Ma, smiled at him, and nodded in greeting. Old Ma smiled politely and let her continue with her work, while he patiently walked to the side and waited. About an hour later, Shui Ying finished all the things she had on hand, and it seemed that she had obtained a temporary chance to take a breather. She let everyone else leave the hall, leaving only Old Ma. Then very naturally and casually, she stretched in front of Old Ma. The long years did not seem to have left too many traces on this beautiful woman. Her face was still exquisite, and her appearance was still beautiful. When she reached out and bent her waist, that graceful willow-like waist and beautiful figure still made people's hearts beat faster. Old Ma looked away after a glance, and politely smiled at the floor in front of him. Then he heard Shuang walk over from her throne, and say something with a smile, asking him to sit with her. "How have you been?" Shui Ying's first words were gentle and ordinary, like an old friend of many years, smiling and expressing concern. Old Ma also smiled and said, "It's quite good." Shui Ying nodded, and then her smile faded. She asked Old Ma a second question. "Do you think the other demigod true monarchs in Zhengxianmeng are all idiots?" At that moment, Old Ma felt his heart beat violently. He did not know why, but at this moment, a somewhat inexplicable thought flashed through his mind. He thought that if he was drinking tea now, he might choke and then spit it out. Would that be very awkward? He paused, took a deep breath, and then looked up at Shui Ying. Shui Ying was looking at him with a smile, and did not have any intention of avoiding his gaze. Looking at her eyes, Old Ma knew that this question most likely could not be answered perfunctorily. He thought carefully, and then frowned. A somewhat sincere expression appeared on his face, and he said to Shui Ying, "Hall Master, please forgive me for being blunt. The other true monarchs in the Immortal Alliance may not be as good as Lord True Monarch Tianlan, or perhaps they all have some secret weaknesses that outsiders do not care about, but I feel that the word idiot really cannot be used on them." Shui Ying nodded and said, "Is that what you think?" Old Ma felt that this woman's gaze was somewhat piercing, but after a moment of hesitation, he still nodded with a bitter smile and said, "Yes." Shui Ying said, "I feel that what you said is right, but I don't know if you have noticed the current situation. But these days on Sky Dragon Mountain, the reactions of those true monarchs of the divine transformation realm really seem to be very idiotic." Old Ma was startled for a moment, then immediately reacted and said, "You mean that their reactions are too slow to the point that it seems like they are stupid?" Shui Ying directly said to Old Ma, "Although we all know that many places in Zhengxianmeng have been rotten for so many years, deceiving the superiors and the subordinates, corruption, power struggles, and the people at the bottom, but no matter what, this is a time of life and death, and it is like fire and water that can explode at any moment. At this time we Fuyunji have already mobilized all of our forces, while the other halls seem to be numb and slow. Do you think this is normal?" Old Ma said, "You are saying that there is a trap in this?" Shui Ying coldly snorted and said, "There are only two possibilities. One, these halls are secretly colluding and preparing some kind of killing plan to deal with us. And on the surface they are pretending to be like this to make us lower our guard. The other is that these guys are even worse than we thought, rotten to the bottom. Their previous strength was only on the surface, and at this time, they can't even gather their strength to fight against us. There are only these two possibilities. Which one do you choose?" Shui Ying asked Old Ma. Old Ma thought for a moment, and said in a low voice, "Even a lion will use its full strength to catch a rabbit, but whether it is the second possibility or not, we can always use our full strength to deal with them." Shui Ying looked at Old Ma, and said, "You are right, but if there is something strange here, it is best for us to figure it out." After saying that, she took out a piece of paper from her bosom and handed it to Old Ma. This is the secret code that we've planted in the mouths of the other halls. Today, you should secretly make contact with them and see if there's anything we don't know about. Chapter 674. After coming out of the main hall of Fuyunji, Old Ma subconsciously raised his head to look at the sky. It should be daytime at this time according to the time, but this world, this celestial dragon mountain, and even the entire immortal city looked gloomy and gloomy, appearing particularly depressing. The sea of blood in the sky was surging, the blood waves rolling, covering almost all of the sky, leaving only a small hole in the center, struggling to let out a beam of light to sprinkle on the human world. In the past, when the weather was normal, Old Ma had never felt that the light in the sky was so precious. Until now, when he raised his head to look at the beam of light sprinkling down from the sky, looking especially small and unusually beautiful in the countless rolling blood waves, he realized that he actually missed the original sky so much. Perhaps it was always only when one was about to lose it that he would miss and cherish such a beautiful thing. He shook his head and walked into the distance. In the middle of the journey, he opened the paper in his hand and looked at it for a while, then folded it expressionlessly and put it into his bosom. There were some names written on the paper, as well as a few ways to contact them. If what Shuang said was true, these people were the shadows that Fuyunji had hidden the deepest in his own Zhangxianmeng. But, were they really the shadows that were hidden in the deepest? Or were they just the shadows that Shuang thought were hidden in the deepest? In Old Ma's mind, on a certain night a few days ago, on that quiet and deserted mountain peak, the words that the charming and beautiful woman said to him, this list did not have her name on it. It seemed like old friends were more reliable, whether it was in terms of friendship or future prospects. Old Ma decided to find a chance to get 2 bottles of good wine later, and then go and flatter Lu Chen. That young man, although cold-hearted and murderous, had one good thing about him, and that was that he cherished old friends. He was still soft-hearted to old friends. But where was he now, and what was he doing? This was what Old Ma thought in his heart. Lu Chen also raised his head and looked above his head. However, unlike Old Ma on Sky Dragon Mountain, the sky above his head was not covered by the Blood Sea anomaly. Instead, it was the dome of a huge grotto. Due to the existence of the blood moon, it actually looked a little similar to the blood moon. The blood moon in the underground cavern seemed to have grown a lot bigger. Although it was still surrounded by the dark red light, and couldn't be seen clearly, from the outline, it seemed to be twice as big as before. Although the underground cave was large, this change was still very obvious. And because of this underground space, Lu Chen soon felt a sense of oppression from the sky after entering this underground city. He felt that his breathing was a little unsteady, and his heartbeat was a little faster. Even the spiritual power in his dantian was a little restless, and his breath was a little messy. For a cultivator of his level, this kind of external interference was very shocking. It should be known that this was even in a calm state. If he went all out in a fight, Lu Chen was not sure if he could completely control the operation of his spiritual power. This was very fatal, and also very dangerous. He turned to look at perfected Lord Tianlan, who was walking in front of him, and found that this damn Baldy seemed to be walking as if nothing had happened. His steps were as steady as a mountain, as if he did not feel the strangeness around him at all, or the blood moon here did not have any effect on him at all. Was this the strength of a perfected Lord of Deity stage? Or was this damn Baldy simply too strong to be human? Perhaps sensing Lu Chen's gaze drifting over, perfected Lord Tianlan turned to look at Lu Chen, then smiled and pointed to the huge statue in the center of the city in front of them, saying, "It'll be fine when we get there." This sentence was a lie, because when Lu Chen followed him to the side of the statue, he found that the strange pressure he felt did not weaken in the slightest. This discovery made Lu Chen a little speechless, but seeing that perfected Lord Tianlan looked as if nothing had happened, he decided that there was no need to say more nonsense on this. However, halfway through, Lu Chen noticed that when the two of them walked past the house, which was also the house where the abnormality occurred when they came down to rescue White Lotus last time, perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to look over casually. However, nothing happened. The two of them just walked to the center of the empty city, And then perfected Lord Tianlon walked to the side of the strange stone statue. After examining it for a while, he turned to Lu Chun and said, "You've been here many times, haven't you? Have you touched this thing before?" Lu Chun walked to his side and said, "Yes." Perfected Lord Tianlon looked at him and asked, "How did it feel?" Lu Chun pondered for a moment, then said honestly, "I feel that there's something strange inside, as if there are many, many monsters locked inside. Although I'm imprisoned and unable to escape, as long as I touch this place, I feel like I'm being dragged inside." After saying that, Lu Chun looked up again, and his gaze swept across the huge stone pillar that was connected to the ceiling of the cave above. He asked, according to the direction, "This thing seems to be below the white tiger statue?" Perfected Lord Tianlon nodded and said, "You're right, this statue is a part of the white tiger statue." Lu Chun nodded silently, and the appearance of the white tiger statue on the ground appeared in his mind. The 4 divine beast statues in the Immortal City were quite famous, and they were the representative buildings of the Immortal City. Even the Immortal City was divided into 4 areas according to the location of the 4 divine beast statues: Azure Dragon, White Tiger, Vermilion Bird, and Black Tortoise. The 4 statues were extremely huge, but no one would have thought that they actually had such a huge part that extended deep underground. At least from Lu Chen's point of view, the lower part of the statue in the cave was even bigger than the statue on the ground. However, although the two were one, it was obvious that the 4 divine beast statues that had existed in the Immortal City for a long time did not have such a strange aura. Otherwise, there would have been countless people who had touched the 4 divine beast statues in the Immortal City. But no one had ever said that they felt such a terrifying aura. Perfected Lord Tianlon did not explain further, and merely waved at Lu Chun before sitting down beside the strange statue. Lu Chun was silent for a moment, then asked in a low voice, "The thing that's imprisoned inside is a ghost?" Perfected Lord Tianlon smiled and nodded. Then he added, "A small portion." "Oh." Lu Chun replied indifferently, then took a deep breath. After a while, Perfected Lord Tianlon raised his hand, reached into his pocket, and took out an item. Lu Chun recognized the shiny golden item. It was the Kunlun seal. Chapter 675. As if sensing Lu Chen's gaze, Perfected Lord Tianlon glanced at Lu Chun with the glittering golden Kunlun seal in his hand. Lu Chun took a deep breath and asked, "Are we going to start now?" "No," Perfected Lord Tianlon denied. "We'll have to wait for a while longer. When the blood sea phenomenon in the sky completely covers the sky, it will be the time for us to open the seal of the relic and completely activate the blood moon." Lu Chun thought back to when he had just descended. The sea of blood above the vault of heaven still had the last bit of clear sky. It was like an incomparably precious gem that was on the verge of collapse embedded in the bloody sky. Lu Chun nodded. After a moment of silence, he said, "I remember that the seal of the ruins has existed for many years. No one has ever entered it. How did you know the method to open it?" Perfected Lord Tianlon smiled and said, "Back then my master, Master Tian Hong, had set it up here. He used his great power to destroy the old seal that had been passed down since ancient times, and was on the verge of collapsing after a long time. Then he set up a brand new powerful seal and told me all the secrets behind it." Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat, and a strange expression flashed across his face. After a moment of hesitation, he asked Perfected Lord Tianlon, "Am I overthinking? Why do I feel that, although there's nothing wrong with what you said on the surface, my Grandmaster left an opening on purpose and told you about it?" Perfected Lord Tianlon smiled and nodded. "We're indeed of the same origin. That's the truth." After a pause, he looked at Lu Chun with a smile and sighed. "It's a pity that your Grandmaster passed away early. If he could see you today, I'm sure he would feel gratified." Lu Chun did not become complacent because of Perfected Lord Tianlon's praise. His Grandmaster, Master Tian Hong, had an extremely high status when he was alive and was almost the same as Perfected Lord Tianlon now. It seemed that such a peerless figure had a very different vision from ordinary people. He was just a little puzzled, so he took this opportunity to ask Perfected Lord Tianlon, "Then I don't understand. Isn't the stronger the seal since ancient times, the stronger the seal is, the stronger it is? Why would it deliberately leave a hole so that people could easily break this seal? Perfected Lord Tianlong looked at him and smiled without saying anything. Under his gaze, Lu Chen gradually frowned. After a while he said, "It can't be that. Grandmaster predicted this situation so long ago, right?" Perfected Lord Tianlong said indifferently, "No one in this world is an immortal, and it's impossible for anyone to predict the future." He definitely didn't expect today's events. Only, he suddenly laughed coldly and said, "Only, when he was on his deathbed he talked to me about the past." Lu Chen's spirit was lifted, and he hurriedly asked, "What did Grandmaster say?" "What a joke." These were the words of a deity transformation stage, true monarch who had looked down upon the mortal world before his death. There was definitely something extraordinary and profound about it. Only a fool would let go of the opportunity to listen to it. Perfected Lord Tianlong waved his hand, but his expression was very calm. He said, "It's not a particularly important secret. It's just some gossip." After he told me about the secret in the underground ruins of the immortal city, he told me that we, the human race, are known as the spirits of all living things. We have been standing in this world for an unknown amount of time, but in these long years, we will always make some ancient mistakes. That is all caused by human nature. He said that the world will always be chaotic and difficult to calm. Even if there are no external enemies, there will always be internal strife and killing among us. At the end of the day, it's still about the unfair distribution. There are hundreds of millions of living beings in the vast land of the divine continent, but the resources to cultivate to become an immortal are always limited. It's impossible to satisfy everyone's needs. No, it's not even enough to satisfy half of the people's needs. The supply and demand are already so tight. However, there are still some people in this world. At this point, Perfected Lord Tianlong's face suddenly revealed a ruminating look. He pointed at Lu Chen and then at his own chest. "Yes, this group of people are like us. Some of them even occupy resources that far exceed what they need. That's why there's a divide between the rich and the poor. The poorer the poor, the richer the rich." Lu Chen stared at the Dambaldi for a while. "You're quite insightful. However, why didn't you say that in the past? Am I stupid to say that?" Perfected Lord Tianlong scoffed at that question. "There are countless people in the world and most of them are no different from ants. The things that I can do with so many resources is much better than what they can do," Lu Chen said. "So you're even deciding the fate of the people in the world for them?" Perfected Lord Tianlong harumphed. "That's right. It's much better for me to decide for them than them." "All right," Lu Chen nodded inside. Creak. The door was pulled open. At that moment, a rare ray of light fell from the sky and shone on the courtyard, adding some liveliness to the cold and lonely place. White Lotus gently covered her eyes with her hands. After a while, her eyes slowly adapted to the light outside the house. Then, she walked into the courtyard and looked up at the sky. The sea of blood was vast and boundless. There was only a hole in the sky at the center. However, the waves of blood kept surging, and it seemed that the last gap would be swallowed up very soon. White Lotus lowered her head. There seemed to be a trace of confusion on her beautiful, but slightly pale face. She subconsciously reached out her hand to support the old tree in the courtyard beside her. However, when her palm rested on the tree trunk, White Lotus suddenly felt something. She abruptly raised her head and looked to the side. She saw that the old tree, which used to be lush and full of vitality, had withered and was full of green leaves. All that was left was creaking and stretching towards the sky. It was as if a dying person was desperately reaching out to the sky to grab at the last life-saving straw. The tree seemed to have died. White Lotus stared at the old tree in a daze. She used her hand to gently push it. The tree did not move at all. After a while, a withered branch made a low crackling sound and fell at her feet. White Lotus looked at the withered branch at her feet. After a moment of silence, she took a step forward and stepped over it. Just like that, she walked out of the house. For the first time in a while, she stood on the road outside. In the distance, she could see the horse-washing bridge. In the dim light, the bridge seemed to have become a sick and powerless person, lying there lazily. White Lotus expressionlessly walked over. After identifying the direction, she began to walk towards the entrance of the underground cave in the Immortal City. Chapter 676. It had been raining for 10 days, making the whole Kunlun mountain seem to be covered with a thick layer of moisture. The mountain was foggy, and it was raining continuously at the foot of the mountain. The sky was also gray, making people feel a sense of suffocation. Until this morning, the rain gradually stopped, and then the gathering dark clouds suddenly dispersed, revealing a bit of blue sky, letting the warm sunlight sprinkle down from between the clouds. Rays of golden light illuminated the world, and from a distance, it was as if the sky was smiling. Kunwa City was originally very lively, but because of the recent continuous rainy days, it became a bit deserted. However, pedestrians could still be seen walking on the street, especially on this new day when the clouds had dispersed. Many people living in the city ran to the street, stretched, and moved their bodies with smiles on their faces. Su Qingjun leaned on the railing of her small building, looking calmly into the distance. She looked at the city, and occasionally looked at the picturesque scene of the sun and dark clouds in the distant sky. She didn't move for a long time, as if she was lost in thought. No one knew what she was thinking at the moment. After returning from the Immortal City, the things Lu Chen told her were not very difficult, but very troublesome, so she needed to be patient and do them slowly. Although the devil cult was declining, it was, after all, a big evil sect that dominated for a time and had tentacles all over the world. For so many years, it was unknown how many spies it had set up in the open and in the dark. It wasn't that there weren't such remnants of the devil cult with powerful combat strength and profound cultivation, but there were definitely not many of them. It could only be said to be rare. And those who could pose a threat to Su Qingjun were even rarer. Therefore, after she returned to the Kunlun party, she had been pushing for these remnants of the devil cult to be tracked down, but the progress had been slow. In different places in the world, sometimes it really made people feel that the speed of the passage of time was different. Su Qingjun felt that when she was in the Immortal City, every day seemed to be very tense, like being strung on a string. But after returning to the Kunlun party, everything suddenly became slow. Everyone was living a quiet and ordinary life. Staying in Kunwa City and the Kunlun party, she would have a kind of illusion that she had become numb. Perhaps she would unknowingly become old like this. Was this kind of life good? Su Qingjun couldn't understand it in her heart. It was just that she had been back for so long, and she herself was an exceptionally intelligent woman. Although no one said anything to her, Su Qingjun still vaguely guessed some things in her heart. Tracking down the remnants of the devil cult was of course very important. At least on the surface, it was an important matter that everyone in the world recognized. After all, the good and the evil could not coexist. But to put it bluntly, of course, this matter was just a matter of face. It was naturally very important for the common people to see. Of the people of the devil sect to see. The evil cult had completely collapsed and could no longer make a comeback. Everyone in the righteous faction knew this in their hearts. However, in order to scare those ignorant mortals, the evil cult could still be used a few more times. But if that was the case, why did Lu Chen ask him to come back? Yes, it was perfected Lord Tianlan's order. However, Su Qingjun felt that if Lu Chen hadn't spoken, the high and mighty ancestor probably wouldn't have cared about a woman like her. Was it because he was worried about danger? He felt that there was some kind of danger in the Immortal City, so he was thinking of ways to get her to leave and return to Kunlun Mountain. A cool breeze blew from afar, bringing with it a slight chill. There was also a slight fragrance of moist vegetation, as if it was blowing from the hazy Kunlun Mountain. Su Qingjun gently tugged at her clothes, as if she felt a little cold. However, her eyes were still looking up in a certain direction. From there, past the city wall, past the even more distant mountains, past the dark clouds and heaven and earth behind the mountains, past a journey of thousands of miles, she would probably arrive at that great immortal city. How was he now? Was there really any great danger in that city? If not, why would he suddenly make up his mind to send me back regardless of everything? Su Qingjun stared blankly at the direction of the immortal city. In her heart floated that day in a secluded corner of the immortal city, the man's slightly bitter and helpless confession. He liked her. Su Qingjun knew this, but she still remembered that the man killed her own brother. Corpses turned cold easily, but hatred was hard to erase. Ding ding ding. A burst of footsteps suddenly came from behind her. It was the familiar pace of Su Qingjun. She sighed softly, took one last look at the distant horizon, and then turned around. When she turned around, there was already an additional smile on her beautiful face. She quickly walked to the top of the stairs and sure enough, she saw her mother, Madame Bai, walking up with the help of 2 maidservants. After the accident on the night of the full moon, because of the heartache of her beloved son, Sumo's death, Madame Bai suffered a great blow. Her spirit almost collapsed, and she was bedridden for a long time. If it wasn't for Su Qingjun asking for elixirs and taking good care of her, Madame Bai would very likely have also died. It was only in recent days that Madame Bai's condition improved, especially after she took an extremely precious elixir that Su Qingjun went to her benefactor, Masato Kohara, to ask for. She was almost completely healed, and could barely walk. Su Qingjun took 2 steps forward, and took her mother from the hands of the maidservants. Then she smiled and nodded to the 2 maidservants, indicating for them to wait and rest at the side. Then she supported Madame Bai to the small building, and sat down at the side table. Mother, you just recovered not too long ago. You don't dare to tire yourself too much. Su Qingjun smiled as she poured a cup of tea, and placed it in front of Madame Bai. She said softly, if there's anything you need, just call someone over and tell me. I will naturally rush over. Madame Bai's complexion looked good. Her face was rosy, and she seemed to be a little younger than before. However, there was still a lot of white in her hair. Presumably, the pain of that year was still deeply engraved in her bones. She waved her hand at Su Qingjun, and said with a gentle expression, it's nothing. I just came out to take a walk. It's not a big deal. Su Qingjun smiled and sat down next to her mother. She said, today you specially came over to my place. Mother, is there something you need? Madame Bai nodded, but did not speak immediately. There was a trace of unhappiness that flashed across her face. Su Qingjun saw this and pondered for a moment. Then she turned her head and waved her hand at the 2 maidservants, ordering them to leave. When there were only the 2 of them left in the small building, she said in a low voice, Mother, why are you unhappy? Could it be? She paused, as if it was difficult for her to say it. In the end, she sighed in her heart and said, could it be because of father? Madame Bai snorted coldly and said, of course it's because of that dead man. You still don't know, but that old man of yours has already made up his mind to marry that slut outside as a concubine. Su Qingjun was silent for a moment. Then she said, she gave birth to a son after all. Father will not let that child wander outside no matter what. Bah. Madame Bai was obviously very angry about this, but she also felt a little helpless. She cursed a few times and then grabbed Su Qingjun's hand. She said, Junior, you are a person with cultivation. Help me. Tonight, sneak over and strangle that slut to death. Su Qingjun's body shook. She raised her head in shock and looked at her mother in front of her. It was as if she had just met this person for the first time. She revealed a somewhat incredulous expression. Chapter 677. Su Qingjun was silent for a long time and did not speak. Finally, it made Madame Bai feel a little strange. She turned her head to look at her daughter and said, what's wrong? Su Qingjun felt that her breathing was faintly difficult. She took a deep breath and calmed herself down. Then she said to Madame Bai in a low voice, Mother, this is not appropriate, right? Previously, Su Qingjun addressed Madame Bai with a very respectful honorific. Although the tone of this mother was not so solemn, the distance between the 2 of them was pulled closer. It felt more intimate. Madame Bai also felt it. Her heart was slightly warmed. She nodded and looked at her daughter with a slightly gentler gaze. However, her mouth continued to say, there is nothing inappropriate. If I tell you to do it, you just do it. That slut outside is just an ordinary mortal. You are now a Jin Dan realm cultivator. You have great abilities. If you want to kill that child, it will be an easy matter. No one will find out. Su Qingjun frowned. There was a willow. the wisp burning in her heart for no reason. It made her annoyed and irritated. However, she still had a calm temperament. She quickly suppressed the fire in her heart. She patiently said to Madame Bai, "Mother, I did not mean that. It is not a question of whether or not I can kill that child, but whether or not I can kill that child. After all, no matter what, that child is father's flesh and blood. In terms of title, he is still my younger brother." As soon as the last two words came out of her mouth, Su Qingjuan's voice stopped abruptly. There was a burst of regret in her heart. However, it was already too late. Sure enough, when Madame Bai, who was standing in front of her, heard the two words younger brother, her face suddenly changed. She slammed the table and stood up. She glared angrily at Su Qingjun and shouted harshly, "What younger brother? Let me tell you, you will only have one younger brother in your life, and that is Sumo. He is your only biological younger brother." At the end of her speech, Madame Bai's voice was sharp and her body was trembling. Even her face was flushed red. Her eyes and eyebrows looked especially ferocious, as if someone had stabbed her in the most painful place in her life. Su Qingjun immediately lowered her head and supported Madame Bai at the same time. She said hurriedly, "Yes, yes, yes. Of course, I only have one younger brother, Sumo. Mother, don't be angry. Don't worry. Let's talk nicely. If there's anything, let's talk nicely." Madame Bai's chest heaved up and down. She seemed to be very angry. She took 2 steps back and sat down on a chair. She was still panting and gritting her teeth as if she wanted to strangle the child outside right now. Su Qingjun stood beside her. Seeing her like this, she felt a wave of sadness in her heart. At the same time, there was a faint inexplicable fear. After a while, Madame Bai's panting slowly calmed down. She raised her head and looked at Su Qingjun. She suddenly sneered and said, "Don't tell me you also think that I have gone mad?" Su Qingjun immediately shook her head and said, "There is no such thing. Mother, your body is not fully recovered yet. You still need to recuperate carefully. When I return to Kunlun Mountain, I will ask for some good elixirs for you so that you can live a long life." After saying that, she paused and suddenly frowned. She looked at Madame Bai suspiciously and said, "Just now you said." Madame Bai smiled sadly and said, "Naturally it is that good father of yours." Su Qingjun was speechless and could only lower her head. Madame Bai said, "Ever since your younger brother passed away, your father has been wanting to have another son to inherit the family business. Shameless old thing." "Mother," Madame Bai sneered and said, "the current Su family business was taken care of by my maiden family in the past. Later on, it was you who worked hard to earn it. Originally, other than providing for your cultivation, the rest of the family business was naturally handed over to your younger brother, Sumo. In any case, I also know that you don't care about these mundane affairs, so this is the best way." She took a deep breath, as if to encourage herself and give herself courage, so that she could continue to face this cruel world outside with her chest out. She said in a deep voice, "But now that Mo, has unfortunately passed away, this family business can only be handed over to you. I don't care about his son's bloodline. I'm not the one who gave birth to him, so I will never admit it." Su Qingjun smiled bitterly and didn't know what to say for a while. Madame Bai looked at her face and suddenly her expression changed. She said, "What do you mean? Don't tell me that even you have a change of heart? Do you think that Mo's death is the end of all troubles? Now you're colluding with your father to go against me?" Su Qingjun looked at her mother. Madame Bai's expression was unusually mournful, which was very different from the past. She couldn't help but feel a chill in her heart and then softly said, "Of course not. Mother, I will definitely stand on your side. Don't be angry. If you get angry and hurt your body, it will be terrible." Madame Bai looked at her for a long time, and then her expression gradually eased. Su Qingjun didn't dare to let her continue talking nonsense. She supported her to go downstairs and at the same time said, "Mother, I will consider these things. After all, it is not a small matter. Let me think about what to do. Go back and rest first and wait for my news." Madame Bai's face revealed a trace of exhaustion, but her mouth was still mumbling indistinctly. Want to steal our Mo's family property? Dream on." One by one, I will kill all of you. The sound of teeth gnashing sounded like curses and curses, which made Su Qingjun frown. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, a maidservant came to receive Madame Bai and supported her. Looking at the gradually disappearing figure, Su Qingjun's face gradually turned pale. She turned and walked back upstairs. Her footsteps on the stairs were especially heavy. When she leaned on the railing again, her gaze seemed to have once again crossed thousands of rivers and mountains, flying to the side of that person thousands of miles away. What is he doing now? There was no longer any warmth in this house. It was as cold as ice. If she had known earlier, perhaps she would have stayed in that dangerous immortal city and stayed with him. Perhaps it would have made her heart feel warmer. When would she be able to see him again? Su Qingjun had never missed that figure that was buried deep in her heart so fervently and longingly. There was no sun or moon underground. The light above his head seemed to never change. Lu Chen waited in the underground city for a long time, but he couldn't tell how much time had passed. What had the outside world become? Had the sea of blood in the sky already drowned the last crack? Had the end of the world arrived? Or was this blood moon about to rise into the sky? He raised his head and looked at the blood moon that was hidden in the dark red light, floating and sinking, indistinctly. Suddenly, Lu Chen's pupils shrank. He saw that at that moment, the blood moon above his head suddenly shook violently. Then, a strong light shone out from the blood moon, passing through all the hazy blood mist and the dark red light, directly dyeing the underground cave a bright red. It was like a sea of blood, drowning everything. There was a sudden movement beside him. Lu Chen turned his head and saw that perfected Lord Tianlon slowly stood up and looked up at the blood moon. After a while, he heard the bald perfected Lord say calmly, "The time has come." Chapter 678. Perfected Lord Tianlon turned around and walked towards the huge statue. Lu Chen followed closely behind him. Then, he heard perfected Lord Tianlon ask, "Have you ever broken a seal before?" Lu Chen thought for a moment, and was a little unsure. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "I've encountered something similar. Of course, I always tried to break it. I didn't pay too much attention to it. Sometimes, it's just a slightly stronger mechanism. I'm not sure if it can be considered a seal." Perfected Lord Tianlon chuckled. "That probably can't be counted." He pointed at the huge silver pillar and said, "Actually, you can think of breaking a seal as opening a door. What we're preparing to do now is more or less opening the door and letting the thing inside escape." "Opening the door?" Lu Chen repeated silently. He felt that it was a little unreal. "Of course, it definitely won't be as simple as opening the door," Perfected Lord Tianlon said with a smile. He looked very relaxed and calm, as though what was waiting for him next was just an insignificant passing cloud. He said very calmly, "The seal that your grandmaster set up back then was definitely the pinnacle of sealing divine arts in our human cultivation world in the past few hundred years. Be it in terms of power or meticulousness, even the divine transformation stage perfected lords of the same generation were filled with admiration. That's why your grandmaster was given full authority to operate it. All these years, there have never been any accidents here. That's proof." Lu Chen suddenly stopped in his tracks and his expression changed slightly. Perfected Lord Tianlon immediately sensed it. He glanced at him from the corner of his eyes, and his lips curled up. However, he revealed a mysterious smile and said, "What's wrong? Did you think of something that you don't understand?" Lu Chen took a deep breath and looked at Perfected Lord Tianlon. He said, "Grandmaster Tian Hong only told you about the secret here?" Perfected Lord Tianlon said matter-of-factly, "Of course. Your grandmaster only trusts me. Even though my senior brother has been with him for many years, he doesn't think that he's worth much. He only leaves everything to me." Lu Chen's expression turned ugly as he said, "Before I came to Immortal City, if I remember correctly, no one in Zhangxianming knew about this place. In the end, the devil cult discovered this underground cave at some point in time, and turned it into their biggest lair." "That's right. That's why I have to thank you for getting rid of a scourge for the people," True Lord Tianlon said with a smile. Lu Chen looked at him for a long time, then sighed and said, "That's why this place is so important. Everyone in the world, including the other people in Zhangxianmeng, may have forgotten this secret because of too much time, but you definitely know it. With your ability, as long as you pay a little attention, you will definitely not allow the evil sect to occupy this strategic place, and perhaps they won't even be able to discover this place. Am I right? Perfected Lord Tianlan did not comment and only said lightly, continue. Lu Chen said, the remnants of the evil sect Elder Ghost and the rest have been occupying this place for so long. You can't possibly not know. In other words, you are allowing them to occupy this place. There was praise in Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes, but he said, you think quite a lot. But let's not talk about whether this is true or not. What do you think I'll get by doing this? I can't possibly give face to the evil sect for no reason, right? You can shift the blame to those trash of the evil sect. Lu Chen seemed to have figured out some key points. His eyes gradually brightened, and his tone of speech also became fluent from the initial thinking about it. He said, this place is a powerful seal that I've set up publicly. Ordinary people can't break it at all. And if it's opened rashly, there will naturally be discerning people in the world who will be suspicious. But if it's occupied by the evil sect, then it's hard to say. Who knows what those vicious, crazy and despicable fellows of the evil sect will do here? Even if there's a problem with the seal, most likely it's the fault of those lunatics. Speaking of this, Lu Chen suddenly gave a wry smile and said, unsealing and releasing the devil, the calamity descending upon the people. This kind of thing seems to be similar to the evil sect's temperament in the past. There's no need to shift the blame to others. Everyone will automatically put the blame on the evil sect. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed out loud, but did not say whether what Lu Chen said was right or wrong. He only smiled and waved his hand before walking to that statue. He looked up at that towering stone pillar that pierced into the cave's dome. He then stretched out his palm, with one finger like a knife, knocked 3 times on the surface of the stone pillar. Dang, dang, dang. The flesh and blood fingers made contact with the solid surface of the stone, and a clear and shocking sound of metal and stone rang out. This sound was clear and melodious, like a bird flapping its wings and flying high, instantly surging in all directions. For a moment, it seemed as if there was an echo from the stone walls of the distant cave, causing the entire cave to reverberate with that sweet-sounding dang-dang sound. Then suddenly, a ray of light shone from Perfected Lord Tianlan's fingertip, and then turned into a golden ray of light that automatically drew a circle around his fingertip on the stone pillar. In the flickering golden light, this circle divided into 3 rays of light at the same time. They spread out in different directions, each drawing a strange and inexplicable pattern. Moreover, after a certain distance, they split again and divided into different golden rays of light, extending further away. Just like that, a magnificent and huge golden pattern began to slowly appear on the statue. Lu Chen stared at the stone pillar that looked as if it was about to come to life. Suddenly, as if he sensed something, he abruptly turned his head to look. He did not know when, but in this empty city, there were actually countless golden rays of light rising up. Those golden rays of light looked as thick as an arm and were as straight as a column. They rose up from different places, some on the streets, some in alleyways, and some from empty houses. There was no pattern to the distance between them, but when Lu Chen looked at this scene, he suddenly felt that it was somewhat familiar. He felt as if he had seen this scene somewhere before, or perhaps he had not. However, such a huge aura, coupled with the surging red light of the expanding blood moon above his head, made him feel a trace of an ominous aura that he had experienced in the past. He thought of that desolate valley, of the battle that changed the course of the battle between good and evil in the world many years ago, and of the formation that had a huge impact on his life, the God-vanquishing spell formation. His heart suddenly began to beat violently. At that moment, he tightly clenched his teeth and closed his mouth, but there was a voice in his heart that seemed to be shouting and shouting silently. God-vanquishing spell. Why is this aura exactly the same as the God-vanquishing spell? Chapter 679. That day, the surging blood-colored clouds in the sky really looked like red waves hanging upside down in the sky. They surged wave after wave, bringing with them the sound of wind and thunder. Deep within the clouds, lightning flickered indistinctly. It was as vigorous as a dragon, but also as restless as a huge silver snake. It shuttled through the sea of blood, and from time to time, it would poke its head out to look down at the world, baring its ferocious fangs. The sea of blood surged and the waves surged, approaching the last bit of gap. The waves rolled thousands of feet, and slowly smoothed out the remaining gap of the halo. Under the dark clouds, the huge immortal city looked very much like a dead city. The once bustling city was no longer there, and everywhere was deserted. At this point, anyone could see that the situation was not quite right. The ordinary people who could leave had already left. Those who couldn't leave, or those who had the heart but were powerless, or those who had great ambitions, wanted to see what would happen here. Life was like this. When you were young, you would always have dreams, always have lofty aspirations and look down on the world. You would hope that one day you would stand at the top of the mountain, and then with slight fatigue and pride, say that life was just like that. However, dreams were dreams. Other than those favored by the heavens who had the right time, place and luck, most people were destined to be just ants. A young man with great ambitions would struggle and work hard for half his life. At a certain time, he would suddenly discover or have an epiphany. It turned out that there was actually an invisible wall in front of him that he couldn't climb over no matter what. He looked around, he racked his brains, he thought of all the methods, and then he discovered that this was the only narrow space left for him in this world. He couldn't go up. There was originally a door on the wall, but it had already been locked by the person behind the wall. Thus, people who cultivated halfway could not advance or retreat. There was no way forward, and it was even more miserable to retreat. Because you had tasted the sweetness and benefits of cultivation, how could you be willing to return to that lowly and poor world of mortals? Countless people were like desperate ants, trapped there. They had to work like cattle and horses for others, and there was nothing they could do. The cultivation world was so harsh, so powerful, and so orderly. No one could challenge this rule. Unless you were a heaven-defying genius, a favored son of the heavens. But if you really were such a peerless character, in the long history of the past, everyone who had climbed over the wall would turn around and lock the incomparably heavy door once again. A young dragon slayer turned into an evil dragon. Most people did not have the ability or the courage to break through their shackles until they suddenly saw a strange change in the sky. It looked like the sky was changing color. Perhaps it would destroy the world, or perhaps it would just break the shackles. The possibility of this happening was actually very low, but there were people who were looking forward to it. For this reason, they did not hesitate to take the risk of staying in this ever-changing city, waiting for the arrival of the apocalypse. They were like lowly mice, but also like despicable killers, gnashing their teeth and cursing the people on the mountain, looking forward to the destruction of the world, looking forward to changing their fate. No one knew when it started, but most of the Xingxian Ming cultivators had returned to Mount Celestial Dragon, unwilling to go down the mountain to the immortal city. The blood waves rolled in the sky, and the immortal city was also gloomy and miserable. Many people had left, and those who were left under the dim sea of blood, for some reason, gradually began to become more and more like beasts. But even on Mount Celestial Dragon, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Several major forces occupied their own territories, confronting each other, but gradually approaching the time when the sea of blood in the sky was completely submerged. The situation on Mount Celestial Dragon underwent a subtle change. Fuyunji still stood firm and guarded the largest territory, but the other forces, to be exact, the forces of the other deity transformation stage cultivators, began to gradually integrate and join forces. The people of the Grand Courtyard could go to the territory of the Heavenly Law Hall. The people of the Starry Hall would greet the guards of the Grand Courtyard with a smile when they saw them. The checkpoint of the Heavenly Law Hall was removed from the people of the Grand Courtyard and the Starry Hall. Everyone laughed and mingled together, like the best of brothers. Their subordinates were like this, and their leaders were also like this. Without the tacit consent of the higher-ups, this kind of thing could not happen. This situation was quickly fed back to Fuyunji. When Shuang opened the note in her hand, she found that half of it was dyed red with blood. It was a ghastly sight. Shuang silently opened the note and read it once, then touched the bloodstain with her finger and looked to the side. Old Ma was standing not far from her with a frown on his face. There are losses? Shuang asked softly. Old Ma nodded and said, when this note was delivered, 3 people died on the way. They were all lines that we buried for a long time. Lines and shadows were common names in Fuyunji, and they represented the same meaning. A trace of sadness flashed across Shui Ying's face. She then took a deep breath and pulled herself together. Her face looked cold and said, are these people planning to ignore everything? They don't want the old rules anymore. Old Ma glanced at the woman sitting at the head of the table out of the corner of his eye. There was a strange look in his eyes, and he felt that it was strange. Now the situation had clearly become clear. What was about to happen was a violent storm. However, how could this hall master of the Floating Clouds division, who was used to seeing such a scene, still be in disbelief at this kind of slaughter? Shuang was silent for a while, then stood up and said to Old Ma, since they shed all pretense of cordiality first, we must also respond. As she spoke, she walked over and handed Old Ma a piece of paper with a few names written on it. She said, these people are the people that their halls planted here. Take some people with you and get rid of them. Old Ma's body trembled slightly, then he nodded in agreement. However, when his gaze swept over the white paper, his expression changed slightly. After a while, he looked up at Shuang in shock. Shuang smiled tiredly and said, what, you didn't think of this? Old Ma was silent for a while, then said, no wonder you would let me handle such a confidential matter. These people, these spies, they can actually climb to such a high position. Shuang said indifferently, there are a few people at the top who actually weren't spies from the beginning. They are the heroes of Fuyunji. They followed me and followed Lord Supreme Tianlan. After many years of hard work, they established the foundation of Fuyunji. Old Ma raised his head and looked at her. Shuang smiled and walked away with her hands behind her back. Only her voice was still slowly transmitted over, saying, it's always this kind of story. People are dissatisfied. There will always be people who feel that their contributions are too great. There will always be people who are dissatisfied. There will always be people who can go through thick and thin with us, but can't share the riches. This and that, they will be pulled over by others. Old Ma suddenly felt an impulse and couldn't help but ask, does the Lord Supreme know about this? Shuang turned around and looked at him with a strange expression. Then who do you think gave me this list? Old Ma suddenly felt a chill in his heart and couldn't say anything. Chapter 680. The light in the underground city had unknowingly become much brighter. This was not surprising, because when the blood moon changed, all kinds of lights lit up. Numerous light beams rose from various places in the empty city, and the slightly oppressive and dim environment here changed. However, the strange thing was that although everything happened so quickly and looked so grand, when the light shone out, it did not make too much noise. The scene of the sky collapsing and the earth splitting did not appear as he had imagined. However, in this strange silence, the pillars of light kept flashing, as if they were ghosts that had opened their eyes in the netherworld, staring at the center of the city. They seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for a change. After a long and painful period of time, the souls that had been suppressed in the abyss and could not break free were all stirred up when they smelled the scent of freedom. In the sky full of light, Lu Chen's eyes finally fell on the small golden seal in perfected Lord Tianlan's hand. The Kunlun seal lay quietly in the palm of that broad palm without showing any abnormality, as if it was also waiting for something patiently. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at Lu Chen, smiled, and asked him in a very gentle and intimate tone, "Are you ready?" Lu Chen stared at this person, neither saying yes nor no. After a while, he suddenly asked Perfected Lord Tianlan, "This matter is of great importance. Not only our lives, but also the lives of all the people in the world may be dragged into it. Why do you always look like you don't care about it?" "Am I?" Perfected Lord Tianlan thought for a while, and seemed to reflect on himself. Then he smiled and said, "Maybe it's because I'm born calm. As long as I can accept it, I'll do whatever I want." Lu Chen nodded and didn't say anything else. Without saying anything more, Perfected Lord Tianlan took 2 steps forward and looked around. He looked at the rising pillars of light and the flickering blood moon in the clouds. Then he slowly clenched the Kunlun seal in his hand. At first, the golden light was gradually blocked by his palm. Then, Lord Tianlan suddenly formed a strange seal with his hand, and a beam of golden light shot out from a strange angle in his palm. Although the light was thin, it was straight and bright. Lu Chen suddenly heard a faint sound reverberating in his ears. He almost thought that he was hallucinating at that moment, but he quickly reacted. The sound seemed to really exist, and what was even stranger was that the sound did not seem to exist in this place at all. It was the sound of the waves. It was as if the waves of the sea were crashing against the shore, crashing against the white sand. Wave after wave, it never stopped, and it was full of order. The air seemed to tremble and sway along with this sound, and an invisible wind blew past him. The wind didn't have the salty smell of the sea breeze, but it carried a hint of blood. Lu Chen's pupils shrank slightly. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be determining the direction. His lips moved slightly as he silently chanted some unknown incantation. His pace was sometimes fast and sometimes slow, and his direction was sometimes left and sometimes right. The only thing that didn't change was that the beam of golden light was always in front of him. Just like that, he began to walk under the stone pillar in the center of the city. Gradually, he actually left the huge stone pillar and walked into the street filled with houses. Lu Chen followed him closely, his eyes always on perfected Lord Tianlan's back. From his point of view, this person's back was wide open, as if he was completely defenseless against him. That wide back was so flat, coupled with the familiar aura of the ancient devil sex god subduing incantation. For a moment, Lu Chen even suddenly recalled that he was standing behind the devil sex elder Yin Shouyang many years ago. Memories flashed through his mind. There were many scenes that he thought he had long forgotten, but now he realized that they were buried deep in his heart and had never been forgotten. This scene was completely different, but he felt a suffocating feeling. It was as if the scene from many years ago was slowly overlapping with the scene that was happening today. Perfected Lord Tianlan walked a long distance in the city with a majestic gait. Along the way, there were many twists and turns. Later on, Lu Chen also realized that it seemed that the beam of light in front of him was showing signs of guiding him forward. After walking to a secluded corner deep in the city that Lu Chen had never been to before, the beam of light fell on a corner and stopped moving. Lu Chen looked left and right, and found that it was an empty house. In a corner of a small courtyard, there was a dilapidated gazebo with old and broken railings. Only the stone slabs on the ground looked more or less intact after years of suffering. The golden beam of light fell on the square stone slab in the center of the gazebo, and then stopped moving. Lu Chen took a deep breath and stared at the stone slab. He didn't know what secrets were hidden under this ordinary-looking stone slab. Was it the entrance to the abyss of hell, or a passage for thousands of demons? Perfected Lord Tianlan flicked his finger, and then slowly opened it. The beam of light disappeared, and the Kunlun seal reappeared in his palm. He walked over and stood directly on the stone slab. Then he waved his hand at Lu Chen and smiled. It was as if he had returned home, as if he was in his Kunlun Great Hall. He then sat down leisurely. Perhaps because he was too fat and too burly, when perfected Lord Tianlan sat on the stone slab, Lu Chen had the illusion that the ground was shaking. He calmed himself down and then walked over to stand beside perfected Lord Tianlan. He asked, "Is this the place?" "This is the place," perfected Lord Tianlan said. "The secret door that my master left behind." He stretched out a finger and tapped on the stone slab beneath him 3 times. Dong dong dong. The sound was low and faintly echoed. A moment later, perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen suddenly looked up at the sky at the same time. The blood moon on the dome of the huge grotto, which had been rotating and swaying slowly, suddenly began to speed up as if it had been stimulated by something. Lu Chen stared at the blood moon for a moment, and then lowered his head to look at perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't look at him again. He calmly picked up the Kunlun seal, put it down, and stamped it on the stone slab in front of him. Then he hit it with the golden seal in the order of east, south, west, and north. Then he reversed the order and hit it again. Amidst the silence, a deep sound suddenly rang out from beneath the stone slab. On the originally seamless stone slab, a square stone slab suddenly sank down by about an inch. Looking at its size, it was about the same size as the Kunlun seal. Perfected Lord Tianlon then raised his head and looked at Lu Qin. Lu Qin only felt that his throat was a little dry. He took a deep breath and then nodded at him. "Since we've come this far, let's do it," he said. Perfected Lord Tianlon smiled, then picked up the Kunlun seal and placed it precisely in that inconspicuous little stone cave. Nothing seemed to have changed. It was still very quiet at the beginning. When the wind blew through the courtyard, their clothes swayed slightly. Then, from the depths of the ground beneath their feet, there was a sudden boom, as if something had suddenly exploded. Chapter 681. An invisible wave spread out from the depths of the ground under their feet. Strangely, Lu Qin did not actually feel the ground shaking, but he could clearly feel a wave surging out in all directions with the pavilion where he and Perfected Lord Tianlon were at the center. Then, a golden light suddenly shot out from the Kunlun seal. This light happened to be only as big as the small stone cave, but it shot straight up into the sky and did not dissipate. The surrounding wind became more intense. Perfected Lord Tianlon and Lu Qin both looked up. Under their gazes, the golden light pierced the dome like a sharp sword. It pierced through the fog, pierced through the red light, and found the blood moon that wandered between illusion and reality. Then, with a sharp whistling sound, the golden light pierced through the blood moon. At that moment, the dark red blood moon seemed to be strung on the golden light. A moment later, the sound of cracking and collapsing came from the top of the dome, which sounded like the wailing of ghosts and wolves, and also like the mournful wailing of ghosts. Only then did Lu Qin realize that his attention was completely attracted by the scene of the blood moon piercing through the sky. He did not notice that after the golden light pierced through the blood moon, it did not stop or disappear. The golden light still pierced through the dome of the cave with the momentum of piercing through the sky. Then, not long after, it shone on a certain place on the dome. The sound of the explosion came from that place. With a loud cracking sound, several huge cracks began to spread from the edge of the golden light pillar. Then, countless small stone fragments fell from the dome above. The cracks grew larger and larger, and the speed of the splitting gradually increased, quickly extending to the entire dome. Lu Qin's expression changed slightly. He suddenly turned to look at Perfected Lord Tianlon beside him, only to find that Perfected Lord Tianlon's expression was still calm, as if he was not surprised at all. It seemed that everything was within his expectations. Lu Qin stared at him silently for a moment, then looked away without saying anything. After such a long time, this underground cave that had existed for an unknown number of years seemed to be ushering in its doomsday. As the golden light from the Kunlun seal pierced through the dome and caused cracks, the scattered lights in every corner of the empty city lit up at the same time, as if they were stimulated or summoned by a leader. In the next moment, hundreds of rays of light shone brightly at the same time, like sharp swords stabbing towards the dome. An ancient and desolate aura was released from this land, as if they had suddenly returned to the distant ancient times. The blood moon in midair was pierced by thousands of arrows. Countless rays of light pierced through the blood moon in an instant. Then these rays of light drove the blood moon and slowly ascended. At the highest dome, the stones crumbled faster and faster. From the initial finger-sized stones, they grew to the size of a head, or even half a body, and fell one after another. This was a deathly rain of stones before the doomsday. The empty city was shrouded by this rain of stones. Loud and ear-piercing collapses sounded one after another. Large holes were smashed in countless houses, and the walls and buildings collapsed, turning them into ruins. As for the place where Perfected Lord Tianlon and Lu Qin were, of course, they could not escape from the falling stones. However, when all the stones fell about 10 feet above their heads, they were bounced off by an invisible and tough barrier and fell obediently to the side. The blood moon that was pierced by countless lights did not show any signs of collapsing or scattering. At most, it only trembled violently a few times when the lights pierced the blood light. Very soon, the blood moon calmed down. Then, surrounded by all the lights, it slowly rose and floated above the dome. Boom! After a loud sound, the collapse of the dome of the cave became faster and faster, as if it had finally reached a critical point. Then, with a loud roar, dust suddenly flew, and an incomparably large stone slab fell with a sharp gust of wind. It was as if a piece of the sky had suddenly been broken, and with a whistling sound, it smashed heavily into the city. In an instant, sand and stones flew everywhere. At least a dozen houses were crushed under the stone slab and turned into nothing. Thick dust rose high like a wave and surged in all directions. Lu Chen looked at the huge stone slab that had fallen in the distance. The corner of his eyes twitched slightly, and then he raised his head and looked up. In the endless dust, there was a ray of light. Although it was not very bright and was a little dim and dark red, there was indeed a ray of light shining in from behind the thick dust. True Lord Tianlan stood up from the ground. Like Lu Chen, he raised his head and looked up at the high dome. Then, after the dust gradually dissipated, they saw the dark red sky. The surging sea of blood seemed to be hanging upside down in the sky. The waves rose and fell, and there was no trace of a normal sky anymore. This underground cave that had been buried deep underground for countless years finally saw the light of day again, and was revealed under the true sky. In the cave, the sword-like rays of light that pierced the blood moon suddenly seemed to have changed. The blood moon was slowly rising. Looking at its direction, it was rising towards the huge hole that had suddenly appeared above its head, and the color of the light that pierced the blood moon gradually dimmed. Not only that, their original golden light actually began to turn blood red. From the ground, it looked like many large blood-red hands, one after another, carrying the blood moon and floating higher into the sky. Such a strange scene made people shudder. Lu Chen stared at the blood moon. Just like that, its speed gradually increased and it gradually approached the huge hole. Then, there seemed to be a sudden clap of thunder in the sky. The blood moon leaped out and suddenly left the underground world and reappeared in the world. At that moment, the blood moon trembled. Then, it shone brightly and emitted tens of thousands of rays of blood-red light, illuminating the entire immortal city and the world. A blood moon slowly rose from the immortal city, looking down on the world with the power of a king. Then it rose all the way to the dome in the sky. In the underground world, it was unknown when it had quieted down. The light rays scattered and dissipated. Even the dark red light at the beginning had left with the blood moon. Darkness returned to this place. It seemed that this was the only color that this place should have. In that quiet and remote little pavilion, True Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen stood opposite each other. Darkness surrounded their figures. After a while, Lu Chen said in a low voice, "Is this the end or just the beginning?" True Lord Tianlan glanced at him, and then looked up at the distant sky. Looking at the blood moon that was rapidly rising in the sky, he said indifferently, "Just the beginning." Chapter 682. The sky and the earth seemed to have become a little brighter. Because there was an additional blood moon in the sky, the dark red sea of blood in the sky added some light. The red light sprinkled down and gradually enveloped the entire immortal city. It also gradually covered the majestic Sky Dragon Mountain. Many people had fled from the immortal city over the past few days, so the city seemed a little empty. However, under the red moonlight, one could still see some figures flashing in some deserted streets and alleys from time to time. They shrank their heads and hid their bodies. From time to time, they would poke their heads out and peep at everything around them. They stared at the mountain peak in the distance. Under the strange blood moon, their eyes were filled with eagerness and greed. The world dominated by the cultivation world had lasted for too long. Many people were suppressed. They couldn't get the resources for cultivation. They yearned to achieve the Tao and become immortals, but they were blocked outside the wall of power. Therefore, when this malevolent and dangerous blood moon phenomenon appeared, they still refused to leave. They stayed here, waiting for an opportunity. However, perhaps these ambitious people who were still staying in the immortal city did not notice that when they focused their attention on the surroundings and used a wolf-like gaze to look for their target, the blood moon in the sky had unknowingly quietly printed a faint layer of red in their eyes. They looked like real beasts gradually. Compared with the temporarily peaceful city at the foot of the mountain, the population density on Sky Dragon Mountain where the Zhangxiameng headquarters was located had now exceeded that of the foot of the mountain. The big shots controlled it well, and the people of the major forces almost did not escape. Everyone defended their own territory, and then looked at the other forces covetously. To be precise, it was actually the three major forces, Heavenly Law Hall, Desai Yard and Starry Hall, who had secretly and openly joined forces to look at Fuyunji covetously. After the blood moon appeared in the sky, the dark red moonlight sprinkled on Sky Dragon Mountain, dyeing the entire majestic mountain range a strange red. However, the imagined fighting and killing did not happen immediately. Everyone was still in their positions, but the atmosphere on the mountain had become very tense. There was no doubt that among the four major forces in Zhengxianmeng, Fuyunji was the natural leader. Whether it was the level of divine transformation stage perfected Lord Tianlan, or the strength of the people under him, Fuyunji was far better than the other three halls. On Celestial Dragon Mountain, the Floating Clouds Company had the largest territory, the most manpower, and the strongest strength. However, now that a powerful enemy was watching from the sidelines, the Floating Clouds Company's internal affairs were faintly unstable. The main reason was that in the past few days, everyone's backbone, the renowned perfected Lord Tianlan, had not appeared in front of everyone for some reason despite the tense atmosphere. This more or less affected the morale of the elites in Fuyunji, but for many years, Fuyunji was stronger than the other halls in terms of discipline, so there was not too much chaos. Otherwise, if it was the other three halls, as long as their old perfected lord did not appear, it would have been noisy by now. Even so, some malicious rumors still began to spread in the Floating Clouds department. Some were cautious and confused, some were guessing why the true monarch had hidden himself. And there were even some who were mysterious and vaguely hinting that there might be people who were afraid of the heavenly tribulation or those powerful external enemies, so they fled first. After all, there were more people who did not appear recently, including the only personal disciple whom they loved and valued the most. He had not appeared for a long time. Once this kind of rumor spread and was not controlled, the consequences would be unimaginable. However, there was a reaction in Fuyunji very quickly. In this dangerous situation where a slight move in one hair could affect the whole body, and in this confusing situation where the four great powers were at daggers drawn, the first to act was the most powerful hall in Fuyunji. Fuyunji was the first to wield the butcher's knife, the first to see blood, and the most shocking thing was that their knife was aimed at their own people. With the infamous and beautiful hall master Shuang presiding over the overall situation, the newly promoted deputy hall master Ma Xiaoyan led a group of elites directly under the hall master, and with lightning speed, swept through the interior of Fuyunji in half a day. They wiped out 3 of Fuyunji's top powers, and killed anyone who resisted. They killed 14 of their trusted subordinates on the spot, and captured 2 of the 3 main leaders alive, while the last one was seriously injured and captured. In this storm-like sudden attack, Fuyunji once again revealed its powerful strength. At the same time, the most famous and mysterious shadow in Fuyunji also appeared again. He appeared beside one of their own people. Beside these captured leaders, there were people who changed sides on the spot, giving these people a heavy blow. Among them, the one who was seriously injured also had the highest position. Like old Ma, he was a deputy hall master of Fuyunji. He was highly respected, powerful, and fiercely resisted the attack. His subordinates were also brave and good at fighting, and they even forced old Ma and his people into a disadvantageous position. However, at the critical moment, behind this deputy hall master, there was a brother who he regarded as his own brother, who used to bleed and bleed for him, who suddenly changed the direction of the blade in his hand and slashed at this deputy hall master. The first slash cut off his right hand, the second slash cut off his left leg, and the third slash was aimed at his chest, breaking his ribs and revealing his white bones. The blade went straight into his chest. At that moment, the fierce battle on the battlefield stopped. Even those on Old Ma's side were stunned. The deputy hall master could not speak because his throat was already filled with blood. He fell to the ground and stared at his brother, his eyes filled with disbelief and despair. His brother held the bloodstained blade and looked at him silently. In the end, he said a few words. "I am the shadow." Before the news of the civil strife in Fuyunji spread, Blood Warbler and Old Ma had already taken control of the situation. Then, under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Blood Warbler did not ask for permission from Supreme Lord Tianlan at all. She directly ordered her people to push the 3 leaders to the border of Fuyunji's territory. The action of the crowd and the murderous intent instantly alerted the other three forces on Mount Celestial Dragon. And the place that Blood Warbler chose happened to be the intersection point of the four forces. For a moment, many people walked out with full vigilance and looked at Fuyunji's side, wondering what they were going to do. Many people had already raised their weapons, thinking that Fuyunji would probably be the first to lose control, and was ready to fight. Fuyunji's side was filled with killing intent. Blood Warbler stood in the crowd and gave the order. Ma Xiaoyan walked forward expressionlessly and took a deep breath. Then he looked at the bloodstained blade in his hand and his similarly bloodstained palm. He swung his blade, and amidst the gasps, he cut off the heads of the three people and threw them away. One head was thrown at Heavenly Law Hall, and two heads were thrown at the Grand Chancellor. Then, only the Starry Hall's side was empty, as if nothing had happened. Chapter 683. On Sky Dragon Mountain. Swords were drawn and bows were drawn, undercurrents were surging, and the atmosphere was extremely tense. In contrast, the immortal city at the foot of the mountain had become very deserted due to the large decrease in population. It didn't look so tense, but in the cold wind, inside and outside the empty streets, there was still a cold murderous aura drifting in the air. Looking at such a situation, probably no one would have thought that just a year ago, this was the most prosperous and lively place in the world. It was the holy land that all the cultivators in the world yearned for. And it was also the center of power in the cultivation world of the Central Plains. All of this was probably due to the mysterious and unfathomable blood sea phenomenon in the sky above them. Now there was an even more bizarre blood moon. The blood moon shone down, silently covering the entire huge immortal city. In the dim red light, there seemed to be a thin mist floating on a certain deserted street. After a while, a slender figure slowly walked out of the mist. It was a young girl with an otherworldly beauty. It was White Lotus. Her complexion seemed to be a little better than before, and there was a trace of redness on her cheeks. Although her body was still a little thin, one could still see that she was a little more energetic and lively. It was probably because her body was still young after the serious injury, and was gradually recovering. There was no one on the street, and it was deserted. In the distant corner of the street or in the dark corner of some alley, there would occasionally be a figure passing by, looking more like a beast than a human. White Lotus's gaze kept looking forward. For some reason, although her expression had been very calm and unchanged, there was a kind of chaotic and interweaving emotion in her pupils. It was like a mess, but also like several different colors of light, constantly changing. Just like this, she walked through half the street, and it was very calm. Nothing unusual happened. Of course, if everything around her looked different from usual, it seemed that the abnormality would also become normal. Those eyes hidden in the dark, bright or dark, at this time, all noticed this single girl walking over. Her beauty, her frailty, and her loneliness all made White Lotus so eye-catching and dazzling on this deserted street. Like a sheep entering a pack of wolves, like a chicken crossing a fox mountain. There seemed to be some commotion in the silent atmosphere, echoing from the shadowy corners. Every time they faced such a desperate and dangerous situation, there would always be some dark side of human nature that would come out and be tested. Most people couldn't stand the test. White Lotus didn't seem to notice those prying eyes, or maybe she didn't care. She seemed to have a lot on her mind, her brows furrowed, as if there was a huge doubt pressing on her heart, forcing her to rack her brains to figure it out. However, even then, she didn't have the slightest hesitation towards the direction she was heading. She seemed to have decided where she wanted to go a long time ago, and she'd never stopped to think about the direction she was heading towards. She'd always walked resolutely towards a certain place in this city. Far away on the street, the majestic white tiger statue was enveloped by the light of the blood moon. Its strange eyes seemed to be staring at this place. When White Lotus walked halfway down the street, she passed by an inconspicuous alley. Because the alley was indeed a little narrow, the light on that side was a little dim. White Lotus didn't even look in that direction and strode past the alley. But at this time, a tall and strong figure suddenly sprang out from that dark alley. It was a burly man, and just the thickness of his arms alone was comparable to White Lotus's waist. With such a huge difference in physique, White Lotus also seemed to be surprised, but before she could react, the behemoth-like man picked up White Lotus. He let out a low woo-woo sound and carried White Lotus on his shoulder. At the same time, his eyes were faintly red, and he fiercely looked around. On the opposite side of the street, in the surroundings, and in the distance, there seemed to be a few figures moving at the same time. It seemed that the people on that side also couldn't bear it, and were getting restless. But there was no doubt that the strength of this strong man hiding in the alley was extraordinary. He even intimidated those potential enemies. Under his fierce gaze, the surroundings still remained quiet, and those moving figures also stopped, then disappeared into the shadows. The man let out a beast-like laughter, and his body retreated. In the blink of an eye, he brought the seemingly powerless White Lotus back into that dark alley. On the long street, it was a desolate scene. Only a gust of cold wind blew, sweeping a burst of chill, bone-piercing cold. The long street was quiet for a while. Then suddenly, there was a strange sound, somewhat abruptly drifting on the street. That sound wasn't loud, nor was it high-pitched, nor was it clear and sharp. It sounded like a person crying in a low voice, slowly suppressing something. There was a vague kind of crazy pain, but it was suppressed by another kind of power. The street became even colder. All of a sudden, the shadows in the dark and in the light became motionless. The wind gradually carried a new sound, as if someone was drinking water, but also like someone was talking to himself, telling an ancient story that no one was listening to, a faint cry. That sound made people's scalps tingle, and their hearts beat faster. Not long after, everyone's eyes fell on the entrance of the alley. The sound came from inside. Pada. There was a light sound like the sound of footsteps on the ground, and then a figure could be seen swaying. A person walked out, slightly staggering. It was White Lotus. Her footsteps were a little unsteady at first, but she quickly found a way to maintain her body's balance, and steadily walked to the street. Her complexion looked a little better. Her face was ruddy, and her clothes were intact. Other than her eyes that still looked a little lost, this girl seemed to be a little better than when she came. Her clothes were clean, as if there was not a speck of dust on them. Only after a careful look would one find that on her pure white cheeks, there were a few faint red spots. They looked like the traces of blood splashing. This girl raised her head to look at the sky, and then continued to walk forward. Her direction was still very clear. She was walking towards the entrance of the tunnel. After walking a few steps, White Lotus seemed to feel something. She stretched out a white palm, gently wiped it on her cheek, and then looked at it in front of her eyes. There were traces of blood on her palm. White Lotus stared for a moment, opened her mouth, and stuck out her small tongue. She gently licked it, and then continued to walk forward without changing her expression. Behind her, in that dark alley, there was a dark corner. After an unknown amount of time, from that dark corner, there was suddenly a dark red thick blood, slowly spreading out, submerging the stone tiles on the ground, like a devil's smile, slowly seeping into the long street. The color of the blood moon in the sky seemed to become even more intense at this moment. Chapter 684. Up and down the mountain, under the blood moon, blood began to flow. The blood was bright red and glaring, but the situation did not suddenly erupt or change drastically. The internal confrontation in Zhengxianmeng on the mountain was getting more and more intense, but they did not start fighting yet. Perhaps they did not know the strength of the other party, so they did not dare to act rashly. The rogue cultivators at the foot of the mountain cherished their lives more, and would not make a move unless they were confident. However, there were still sporadic fights in various corners of the city. Under the gloomy sky, the suppressed sparks were slowly lighting up. In the underground cave where the sky was broken, perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen were still sitting in the gazebo in the courtyard. Lu Chen looked up at the big hole on the top of the blood moon, frowning as if he was thinking about something. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him and said, "What are you thinking about?" Lu Chen pointed at the big hole on the top of the head and said, "I think it's a little strange." "Why do you say so?" Perfected Lord Tianlan asked. Lu Chen said, "Before we came down, there were many guards at the entrance of the tunnel. It's a little strange that no one came to check the situation after such a big commotion." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment and nodded. That's true. Do you think something happened over there? Lu Chen said. The other perfected lords of the divine transformation realm are not fools. They won't just sit there and wait for you to mess around. They must have some tricks up their sleeves. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to have no objection to Lu Chen's judgment. He nodded and said, That makes sense. They are all old foxes. Something must have happened over there. Do you want to go and take a look? Lu Chen turned to look at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, If something happens over there, will it affect what you are going to do next? Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head and said, It won't unless those 3 old fools come together. But I don't think they would expect that I won't be in Fuyunji at such a critical moment, right? Lu Chen replied with an, Oh, and then sat down beside Perfected Lord Tianlan with a calm expression. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with interest and said with a smile, Why? Aren't you going over there to take a look? Lu Chen said calmly, I'm not an idiot. If something really happened over there, wouldn't I be walking right into a trap if I went alone? If it wasn't for the fact that you really have a request here, that's all. Since it doesn't affect the overall situation. Of course I'm comfortable staying here with you. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed out loud and pointed at Lu Chen. I like how straightforward you are when you speak to me. Lu Chen ignored his exaggeration. He sighed and said, Whatever you're going to do next, you'd better do it quickly. To tell the truth, looking at this sea of blood and that blood moon, even I am terrified. All right. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. There's no hurry. It shouldn't take too long. His expression was very relaxed, without the slightest worry or annoyance. He even reached out and patted Lu Chen's shoulder lightly. Why didn't I realize that it's so much easier to have someone like you to talk to when I'm doing such a big thing, than when I'm always making decisions alone? After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, Have you ever trusted anyone so much in the past? Perfected Lord Tianlan thought about it, and a trace of regret flashed across his face. He shrugged and said, No. Continue. Perfected Lord Tianlan said to Lu Chen, There's still a lot to do. Lu Chen looked up at the blood moon in the sky and said, That blood moon is still not enough. Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, The ferocious tide of the blood moon can affect one's mind imperceptibly. If one's cultivation is not strong enough, his mind will be corrupted and he will gradually become a bloodthirsty lunatic. Even those with extremely high cultivation will be affected unknowingly if they don't resist it carefully. Lu Chen said, With such a huge blood moon hanging in the sky, and this disgusting sea of blood, who wouldn't be careful if they said they were scared to death? I don't think those perfected lords will fall for it. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed and said, Who told you that the blood moon's aura only started today? Lu Chen was startled for a moment, and then his expression changed slightly as if he suddenly remembered something. He said, You're saying that underground? Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered. The blood moon appeared underground, so it must have been affected since then. Moreover, it's invisible and traceless. Who can guard against it? Lu Chen was silent. Of course, he wouldn't ask why Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't tell him about it, so that he could be prepared. There was no need for Perfected Lord Tianlan to lie to him now. Since he said that the power of the blood moon affected those perfected lords of the divine transformation realm, then it must be effective. It was just that he couldn't see it for the time being. Perhaps those few perfected lords had high cultivation and were immune to evil. Or perhaps they were hiding in their bodies and could explode at any time. It was just that this scheme was truly profound. Continue. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and waved his hand. Finish this as soon as possible so that everyone in the world can be reborn. With that, he sat on the ground and extended a finger, pressing it gently on the Kunlun seal. Lu Chen took a deep breath and sat beside Perfected Lord Tianlan. He stared at the Kunlun seal that could activate everything. His expression became calm again, and his eyes didn't change. However, a faint light flashed in the deepest part of his eyes. The Kunlun seal shone with a golden radiance once again. This time, it was even brighter than before. It was unknown what method Perfected Lord Tianlan had used, but suddenly, A rumbling sound came from the depths of the ground beneath the small pavilion. It was as though some heavy and huge rocks were moving. Furthermore, it was not just one but many rocks. The ground beneath Lu Chen's feet began to tremble irregularly. For some reason, a strange image appeared in Lu Chen's mind. It was as if he was in a huge underground spell formation. Huge rocks formed the foundation of the spell formation. Now, the huge rocks were shaking off the debris left behind by the passage of time. They moved left and right and rearranged themselves. Deep underground, unknown to the people of this world, an earth-shattering change was slowly brewing. Perhaps it was a hole, perhaps it was an exit, or perhaps it was a path longed for by the darkness underground. On the ground, the surroundings of the huge hole created by the blood moon had already turned into ruins. Only a few rays of light that shot into the sky remained in the pile of rubble. At this moment, a figure slowly walked over from afar. It was a beautiful girl. It was White Lotus. She was alone, and her expression seemed to be at a loss. It was unknown what had led her all the way here. However, when she saw the huge hole, White Lotus's body suddenly shook as if she had thought of something. She quickened her pace and walked toward the hole. However, when she was halfway to the edge of the hole, she suddenly turned her head and looked at the original entrance of the tunnel. Then her delicate and beautiful brows suddenly furrowed. Chapter 685. When the blood moon broke through the grotto, it made a lot of noise. The rocks were shattered and the place was in a mess. Several small stone mountains were formed around it. Even the entrance of the tunnel on the long street was smashed by a few large stones. It looked very messy. However, what attracted White Lotus's attention was not the standing boulders, but the many corpses lying on the ground under the rubble that had been crushed by the stones. White Lotus stared at that side for a moment, as if she wanted to go over and take a look. But when she took a step forward, she suddenly stopped and turned to the other side. Her face showed a little surprise. A low growl came from behind an irregularly shaped boulder. After a while, a huge black figure turned out from behind the boulder. It was Atsu. White Lotus's attention immediately turned from the tunnel entrance to Atsu. She looked up and down at the strong and huge black dog. White Lotus frowned, and the blank look in her eyes disappeared. She showed a look that she was familiar with in the past. She said, "Hey, you stupid dog. You seem to have grown a little." Atsu stared at White Lotus, but did not respond to her words. Atsu's reaction to this beautiful girl had always been very strange and subtle. Most of the time, it was obviously alienated, but sometimes it had a different kind of recognition. White Lotus took a few steps forward and came close to Atsu. Sure enough, Atsu did seem to be a little taller than before. Her current height only reached Atsu's chin. A beautiful girl standing next to a huge black dog. The contrast was really a little strong. White Lotus looked up at the sky. The shadow of the blood moon was reflected in her eyes. After a while she said, "You see, this world is so unfair. When the blood moon rises, the people are in misery. I don't know how many people have suffered and will be destroyed. But a guy like you with an extraordinary bloodline can take the opportunity to grow and evolve." Atsu's head was slightly lowered, and a pair of eyes looked at the girl vigilantly. It seemed that it was still very wary of her. White Lotus smiled, turned her head and looked around. She asked, "Where is Lu Chen? Haven't you been following him?" Atsu flicked its tail, and did not say a word. White Lotus looked thoughtful. She looked past Atsu's body and glanced at the big hole behind it. She nodded and said, "If you are guarding here, he is still down there?" "That's right. At such a critical time, this place is the most important." After saying that, she walked towards the huge hole. Obviously, she wanted to go over and see what the situation was like at the bottom of the big hole. After walking for a while about 10 feet away from the hole, White Lotus suddenly noticed something. She looked back and saw that Atsu was still squatting next to the original boulder, looking at her motionlessly. Even when it saw White Lotus looking back at it, the black dog even shook its tail and tilted its head, pretending to be harmless. White Lotus looked at it for a while and then said, "No, there's something wrong with you." White Lotus turned her head and began to look at the hole not far away. After carefully observing for a moment, she saw that around the edge of the hole, among the piles of rocks, there were faint thin golden lines flashing. Some of them were submerged in the soil, and some were buried by the gravel. But as long as one looked carefully along the lines, they would find that around the huge hole, someone had set up a strange magic array, completely surrounding the hole. White Lotus took 2 deep breaths, then took a few steps back. She turned around and walked all the way back to Atsu. Atsu looked at her, and there seemed to be a trace of regret in its eyes. White Lotus spat at it and said, "You are really not a good dog." Atsu turned a deaf ear to this comment. It stood up while wagging its tail, and walked to the side. White Lotus was about to leave when she looked at Atsu again. She suddenly smiled and said, "Why don't you come with me?" Atsu raised its head and looked at her. White Lotus pointed at the hole and said, "With that damn thing around, no one can go down. Why don't we take a detour and have a look?" Atsu's eyes flashed, then it stood up without hesitation. White Lotus smiled and walked to the other end of the tunnel. The strange combination of the girl and the black dog slowly walked to the entrance of the tunnel. Before they got close, they could smell a strong smell of blood. White Lotus frowned and looked left and right, but Black Dog was 1 step ahead of her. It jumped on a large rock a few feet away from the entrance of the tunnel, then turned around and barked at White Lotus. White Lotus quickly walked over and looked behind the rock. Her body trembled slightly. There was a big pit, and the pit was full of blood. Even the ground around the pit seemed to be dyed red. Bai Lian furrowed her brows and glanced at the corpses on the ground in the distance. All she saw was that the corpses were deathly pale and completely devoid of blood. She snorted and muttered to herself, "Even if I practiced the blood food secret method, I wouldn't go so far. What the hell is that thing?" The entrance of the tunnel was open. At this time, they couldn't see what was going on underground. White Lotus was about to go down, but after taking 2 steps, she suddenly noticed that Black Dog had been staring at the blood in the big pit. Black Dog's eyes were flashing as if he couldn't bear it anymore. White Lotus's body paused for a moment. She suddenly walked over and slapped Atsu on the head. Then she scolded Atsu fiercely. "Are you crazy? Do you believe that if you go down and take a sip now, Luchin will wring your neck when he finds out?" Atsu let out a low growl and turned around with some difficulty. White Lotus saw a touch of red in its eyes. The two looked at each other for a moment. Atsu was the first to look away and jumped into the tunnel without saying a word. White Lotus let out a long breath and followed. Then she suddenly laughed at herself and said, "Are you crazy? Why would you suddenly be kind enough to save this dog?" She looked up at the blood moon, and a trace of confusion suddenly appeared in her eyes. Then she quickly lowered her head and jumped into the tunnel entrance. A rumbling sound came from the darkness, and then there was a red light silently falling in the surroundings. Luchin suddenly sensed something. His expression changed slightly and he stood up from the ground. At the bottom of this huge catacomb, in an unknown corner of this empty city, outside the 4 walls, a few seemingly invisible forces suddenly stirred up from the other side of the wall. 3 directions appeared at the same time, sandwiching him and True Lord Tianlan in the middle. His heart suddenly beat faster. Chapter 686. The blood moon hung high in the sky, shining in the strange smoke and clouds, as if it was floating in a sea of blood. The dark red moonlight sprinkled down from the sky, completely enveloping the entire immortal city. If one looked from afar, they would probably see a huge inverted dark red bowl. In the headquarters of Zhengxian Meng on Sky Dragon Mountain, the atmosphere was extremely tense. Every family was very cautious, for fear that they would accidentally restrain their subordinates. If a spark were to ignite the entire Sky Dragon Mountain, which was like a barrel of dynamite. It was precisely because of this that Heavenly Dragon Mountain had actually become unusually quiet during this period of time. Besides the Floating Clouds Agency carrying out an operation to kill spies and tossing 3 heads into the territories of other powers, causing a commotion, the various powers were extremely well behaved during the rest of the time. In this situation, although Fuyunji was vaguely at a disadvantage of fighting 1 against 3, from top to bottom, almost no one in this powerful hall showed a hint of fear. Instead, Most people were very excited and their fighting spirit was high. If it wasn't for Hall Master Shui Ying's deliberate suppression, the people of Fuyunji would have already killed their way out. In this turbulent and fierce fighting spirit, Old Ma didn't know why, but he felt somewhat out of place here. He was very worried. He was very puzzled and anxious about the possibility of Fuyunji fighting 1 against 3, but the atmosphere in Fuyunji made him not dare to say these words directly. Otherwise, what awaited him would probably not be a good ending. Fear of the enemy, timid as a mouse, disloyal to the master, overcautious and indecisive, and so on. Any one of these labels could make him bear the consequences. Such a tense and somber atmosphere was something that Old Ma had never experienced in Fuyunji for many years. He didn't even know when this atmosphere started. Unknowingly, under this tense atmosphere, the interior of Fuyunji suddenly became like this. Everyone was infinitely loyal to that supreme Tianlan and infinitely hated the enemy. Whether it was the Desai Yard, Heavenly Law Hall, or Starry Hall, it didn't matter. The people of Fuyunji were not afraid. As long as the enemy went against them, they would be defeated. A person could not say anything against such a strong and intense context, not even Old Ma. He wisely chose to follow the group consciousness that was gradually going crazy. Fortunately, he soon realized that in Fuyunji, other than himself, there was another person who seemed to be still conscious. Although this person was actually the one who personally ordered the massacre, Shuang. Old Ma only noticed this when Shuang took the initiative to find him. Old Ma immediately expressed his worry to her. Hall Master, if this goes on, things won't be right. Shuang looked very tired, as if she had aged a few years in this short period of time. She looked at Old Ma indifferently and said, "What's wrong?" Old Ma smiled bitterly. Hall Master, you are asking the obvious. He pointed outside the main hall and lowered his voice. Those people outside, even if we defeat those 3 clans this time, will they all turn into lunatics in the end? Shui Ying was expressionless. After a while she said, "Let's win first. We may not win if we fight 1 against 3. Old Ma was speechless and then sat down weakly. After a while he said, "Where is Lord Supreme? Why hasn't he come out after so many days, especially in this kind of situation?" Shui Ying said indifferently, "Lord Supreme is a divine strategist, not something we mortals can guess. I just need to do my own thing." Old Ma was speechless, then he said, "All right." Shui Ying thought for a moment, then frowned slightly and said, "But it's also strange. We don't know where the perfected monarchs are, so we don't dare to act rashly. But aren't the soul formation perfected monarchs of the 3 clans all here? Why are they so well behaved? Strange." Old Ma was startled for a moment, but then his heart skipped a beat. Before this, his attention had been focused on the strange atmosphere in the floating clouds office. Unlike Shuang, he hadn't paid attention to the abnormalities of the other 3 families. Now that she had mentioned it, he immediately realized that something was wrong. Old Ma pondered for a while, then said uncertainly, "Those 3 families seem to be waiting for something?" Shuang looked at him and said, "Waiting for what?" Old Ma said, "I'm waiting for an order." As he said that, he pointed his finger upwards. Shui Ying's eyes suddenly lit up. She looked at Old Ma and said in a low voice, "Could it be, they are like us, waiting for Lord Supreme to make a decision or give an order?" Old Ma nodded heavily. His breathing also became a bit hurried. He said, "Most likely. Otherwise, why haven't the 3 families attacked us yet?" Shui Ying's eyes became brighter and brighter. She said, "You mean those lords are probably not on this Sky Dragon Mountain?" Old Ma swallowed a mouthful of saliva and laughed dryly. "I think it's very possible, but this is related to a perfected cultivator of the soul formation realm." Shuang took a deep breath and said slowly, "It's the last moment. It's time to use those last shadows." "Investigate." Shuang stood up. Her gaze was as sharp as a knife. At the same time, for some reason, there seemed to be some intense fanaticism in her. She said, "Get all the shadows to investigate. Find out where those soul formation perfected monarchs went. If they are not on this mountain, it will be a great opportunity for Fuyunji." Old Ma nodded and retreated, but in his heart he didn't think much of it. He thought, Shuang looked calm before. Why did she become so agitated in the end? When he walked out of Fuyunji's main hall, he looked up at the sky. Suddenly his body shook. At this moment he suddenly thought of the answer he wanted. The atmosphere in the central plains of Fuyunji was originally normal. When did it suddenly change until it became so warlike today? He carefully recalled the past, and found that it seemed to have started when the blood moon suddenly broke out of the ground and hung high in the sky. He was a bit confused. For some reason he suddenly wanted to leave this mountain, leave this city. Unfortunately, it was already a bit too late. He looked down the mountain and thought to himself, those 3 deity transformation stage perfected monarchs are not here. Could they have gone down the mountain? And the people on this mountain are going crazy. I wonder if the people at the foot of the mountain are any better? Oh woo! An ear-piercing howl came from a corner of the immortal city. A strange-looking monster flashed in a dark alley in the immortal city, then slowly left. Behind it, the blood on the ground was silently spreading. After a while, there was a plop sound. Something fell from the sky and fell right into the pool of blood. It was a palm that had been bitten off. Chapter 687. Sometimes, it was really hard to say whether the most important thing in a force was a deity transformation stage perfected monarch, or the numerous cultivators who made up the majority of the force after having a deity transformation stage perfected monarch, who was almost completely superior to ordinary cultivators. In a thriving, constantly developing, and perfect force, as the supreme leader, the spirit-severing stage true monarch often had supreme authority and power. In the vast majority of cases, the spirit-severing stage true monarch himself would naturally become the natural representative of the force. When everyone thought of such a force, the first person that came to mind was such a spirit-severing stage true monarch. For example, when it came to Fuyunji, they would think of Tianlan. When it came to Heavenly Law Hall, they would think of Taihu. When it came to Grand Chancellor, they would also think of Guangbo. This had almost become an unwritten rule. And most of the time, because of the powerful influence of the spirit-severing stage true monarch, their personal temperament and characteristics would also affect the image of their force. For example, Fuyunji was very much in line with Tianlan's belligerent, valiant, untamed, and even supercilious temperament. The people of Heavenly Law Hall were often more old-fashioned and unyielding, very much like Taihu. As for the people of Grand Chancellor, everyone seemed to prefer money. Therefore, most of the time, the spirit-severing stage true monarch was really one with the force on their side. In the eyes of most people, the most important thing in a force was of course the spirit-severing stage true monarch, including the spirit-severing stage true monarch himself. Everything could be sacrificed. As long as one was alive, the force, subordinates, and people could be rebuilt again. At most, it would be a little troublesome. It was unknown whether this was the natural thinking of those in a superior position. Like gods, they looked down on the world and regarded mortals as ants. They were indifferent and merciless, and probably didn't care much about the lives in their hands. For example, if the lives of 70% of their subordinates could be exchanged for the life of Tianlan, then Taihu, Guangbo, and Guyu probably wouldn't hesitate at all. Although these things were cruel and merciless, it was actually not uncommon in the long history of mankind. Most mortals didn't understand, but there were always some people who loved to read. Sometimes these people didn't want to die. They wanted to change their fate, and from time to time, they would cause some trouble. A long time ago, a highly respected deity transformation stage perfected cultivator had given these troublemakers a nickname, saying that they were restless ants. Although they were restless, they were still ants. When Lu Chen sensed the 3 auras from outside the house, he suddenly felt like an ant. Although there was nothing strange outside the wall, the invisible aura was like rolling waves. Although there was no tremor in the ground, it was as if a giant had stepped on it, surging over with the force of an avalanche. It was not as if he had never seen such a powerful aura before. A long time ago, perfected Lord Tianlan had a similar aura. It was like a mountain, like a god, and like a demon. Furthermore, the aura of that damn Baldi was even more powerful than the 3 forces outside. Of course, now that the 3 forces had arrived together, Their auras had firmly suppressed perfected Lord Tianlan. Lu Chen didn't need to guess who the people outside were. Sometimes strength was the best proof, and it couldn't be faked. However, at the same time, there were countless questions that arose in his mind. Why did those three outside actually come to this underground cave together? They actually abandoned the meticulously prepared arrangements on Heavenly Dragon Mountain, directly jumping out of the maze and directly attacking the root of the problem. They seemed to have viciously seized the Floating Clouds Division's core weakness in one go. Lu Chen didn't doubt that he and the damn Baldi had come here in the most secretive manner. The news couldn't have been leaked. Otherwise, if perfected Lord Tianlan couldn't even do this, he wouldn't have been able to achieve what he had today. He turned to look at perfected Lord Tianlan beside him, only to see that the damn Baldi's expression was the same as usual, as if he was not surprised at all. He just raised his head slightly and stared at the high wall in front of him. His eyes flashed with interest, as if he was waiting or expecting something. What was he waiting for? Was it a person, or something that was about to happen? Lu Chen felt a little nervous, and his throat was a little dry. His mind was spinning frantically, and then he suddenly thought of something. He felt as if he had vaguely grasped something at that moment, as if there was something that he had overlooked. That dragon. The black dragon. The black dragon that he had personally gone to the sky of the forbidden area of Kunlun Mountain, and secretly brought to Immortal City with the Kunlun seal. He had only seen it once, and then disappeared without a trace. Where did the black dragon go? Perfected Lord Tianlan slowly stood up, and took a step forward. One of his feet landed on the stone slab in front of him, stepping on the Kunlun seal. The golden light immediately disappeared, and was completely covered up. The aura in the courtyard became much quieter, but soon, another new powerful and unruly aura rose like a mountain. It even overflowed the entire courtyard, and it was overbearing. That was perfected Lord Tianlan's own aura. My old friends, it's been a long time. He laughed loudly, and his figure was as lofty as an abyss and a mountain. He looked down on the world and said with a smile, "Why don't you come in and talk?" His voice was like a wave, reverberating far away. It reverberated in this huge underground cave, and seemed to cause a circle of ripples in the air. No one responded to the three powerful auras outside the wall, but after a while at the front of the house, the door that Lu Chen carefully closed after perfected Lord Tianlan, and Lu Chen came in, suddenly creaked and was pushed open. Then a person walked in. He had white hair and a ruddy complexion. It was perfected Lord Tiehu. He walked slowly with a calm expression. There were many winding corridors and gardens in this house, and it was quite interesting. But perfected Lord Tiehu had no intention of taking a detour. He just stared at perfected Lord Tianlan and stared at him. Then he walked straight towards him. He did not take a detour, nor did he take a turn. In front of him, all the stones, corridors, flowers, and trees in the way were suddenly pushed away, pressed down, and then crushed by an invisible force when they were about 10 feet away from the old man. Trees were uprooted and flew out of the wall. Boulders rolled into the distance, and the corridors tilted and collapsed, making way for him. He walked majestically to the small pavilion, then looked at perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "You're finished, Tianlan." Chapter 688. "You're done for" sounded very down to earth, like the threatening words that mortals use when quarreling with each other in the streets. Their faces were red and their necks were thick, and they were accompanied by a sneer of ridicule. It was not in line with people's imaginations of a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator. At the very least, he would say something more majestic. He would either hide his intentions, speak with a hidden meaning, or have a profound meaning, or make people think of endless possibilities. In the end, true monarch Tiehu came up with such a simple statement. It really made people's jaws drop. But this sentence, which did not seem to fit his identity, after Supreme Taihu said it, made everyone present, whether they were inside or outside the room or not, feel that it was natural and very imposing. Perhaps this was the natural halo of a person who was in a high position. Once you had power and status, whatever you said would be right most of the time. It was ridiculous for mortals to say such words, But it was amiable for a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator to say the same words. It was ridiculous and contemptuous for mortals to fight, but a fight between a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator would cause the world to change color, and all living beings to revere him. Immortal Tianlan did not seem to have much of a reaction to Immortal Tiehu's simple words. He even smiled curiously and said, "Oh, why do you say so? You are perverse and unjust." He looked straight at Lord Tianlan and said in a clear voice, "All living beings in the world have been harmed time and time again. The people have no way to live and their blood has flowed. You have suffered for a long time. The cultivators in the world want to pursue the Tao of immortality, but the Fuyan Agency has been imposing taxes and plundering the world's rare resources for their own use. They have been unable to improve themselves and you have suffered for a long time. The alliance of perfected immortals is originally the righteous path in the world, but because of you, you have been tyrannical and tyrannical. You have exploited the common people." This long passage of words contained 3 lines of, "I've been suffering for a long time." It was said with a long breath and a majestic aura, making people sigh in admiration. They thought to themselves that this was indeed the words of a deity transformation stage perfected monarch. Even Lu Chen could not help but sneak a glance at perfected Lord Tianlan, thinking to himself, although these words sound like irresponsible and random framing, it seems to be somewhat justifiable if this damn Baldy is really the culprit. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked a little displeased after being scolded in such a manner. He waved his hand and said, "We're all the same here. It's the same no matter who it is. Cut the crap." True Lord Steelpot sternly said, "Nonsense, you are the only one who did all these bad things." Perfected Lord Tianlan glared at him and suddenly grinned. "All right, got it. If I still win after today, then all these bad things will be on your head." True Lord Steelpot's expression did not change, as if he did not care, and said, "As you wish." Perfected Lord Tianlan continued, "There's someone else here. Why don't you come in and meet us?" Taihu True Monarch did not speak. After a moment, the west wall of the courtyard suddenly let out a muffled rumble, and then the entire wall collapsed. After a while, amidst the flying dust, perfected Lord Guangbo, the first seat of the Dazai yard, strolled in slowly with an amiable smile and a gentle expression. He said to perfected Lord Tianlan with a smile, "Long time no see, long time no see." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at perfected Lord Guangbo, seeing that the two of them had separated from each other, and formed a pincer attack with him. He did not say much and only smiled. "Where's the other one?" As soon as he finished speaking, he heard a voice behind him. It seemed to be on the long street outside, but it also seemed to be at the end of a street further away. Although the voice was clear and loud, the tone was erratic, as if it was constantly moving. The voice said with a long laugh, I'm here. Listening to the familiar voice, it was the master of Starry Hall, perfected Lord Guyu. Lu Chen secretly furrowed his brows. Even though Guyu perfected Lord hadn't revealed himself completely, his current position formed an iron triangle with perfected Lord Steelpot and perfected Lord Guangbo, trapping perfected Lord Tianlan in the middle. This meant that there was no leeway, no way out. For many years, no one had dared to kill a divine transformation stage perfected Lord. The reason for this had been mentioned many times. This time, it seemed that they had made up their minds. If he could see it, the other divine transformation stage perfected lords would certainly understand the hidden meaning. For a while, these divine transformation stage perfected lords did not speak. It was unknown whether they had nothing to say, or were waiting for something. But at this time, the three divine transformation stage perfected lords in the courtyard suddenly looked up at the same time. They saw that in this abandoned underground city, there was a strange and magnificent magic formation, and all kinds of flickering and rising light beams suddenly changed. About 30% of those rising light beams suddenly dimmed, and then quickly disappeared. The result of that was obvious. The once vibrant and visibly powerful spell formation suddenly became shaky. Without the supporting beams of light in many crucial locations, the unique ancient and boundless presence of the surroundings weakened at once. Lu Chen was especially sensitive to this because he had only felt this kind of feeling from the demon sex god subduing incantation formation many years ago in the Battle of the Desolate Valley. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression changed slightly, and a trace of killing intent flashed across his face. He said coldly, "You actually did something here." Perfected Lord Guyu of Starry Hall's deep and long voice floated over from afar. "It's just some insignificant tricks. It's just a little trick passed down from the ancestors." After a pause, he said with a smile, "Back then, you asked me to help you set up the formation. Although you also cleaned it once after that. These small loopholes are the Starry Hall's ability to make a living. It's not a big deal that you didn't find them." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment, then sighed and said, "When I asked you for help, these things didn't happen at all. Did you already have the intention to plot against me at that time?" No. True Monarch Guyu's voice denied. "That's impossible. Dao brother Soaring Sky, you're a man of great talent and bold vision. I, your little brother, would never dare to go against you. These are just some small things that you added in casually, they're not worth mentioning." "Little tricks that are not worth mentioning casually?" Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered, but his expression became more and more serious. In front of him, Perfected Lord Tiehu and Perfected Lord Guangbo looked smug. Immortal Guangbo said leisurely, "Tianlan, your biggest mistake is that you left Celestial Dragon Mountain. If you were still in the unfathomable Kunlun Palace, we would still be a little afraid of you. But now that you're in the underground, you're courting death." Perfected Lord Tiehu sneered. "Here, the three of us are fighting against one of you. On the mountain, 3 forces are attacking one of you. No matter how I look at it, you're dead meat. What else do you have to say?" Speaking of this, he smiled and touched his beard. "I told you that you're dead meat, but you didn't believe me." Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him, then grinned and stretched out his palm to touch his bald head. You're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.